What if a waitress from Queens suddenly discovered she was the heir to $1 billion fortune? This isn't a fairy tale. It's exactly what happened to Eliza Moore when a mysterious letter and a long-buried secret shattered the walls between two worlds. A simple life, a powerful family name, and a truth hidden in French ink. This is where everything begins. Before we dive into the story, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Eliza Moore's life moved in quiet, predictable rhythms. Every morning began at the break of dawn in a modest two-bedroom apartment in Queens, where she brewed coffee for her aging grandmother and packed her apron for another day. At the small diner near Roosevelt Avenue, she had no illusions of glamour or grandeur, and the occasional whisper of "you're too smart to be a waitress" from well-meaning customers did nothing to stir ambition. She spoke fluent French thanks to her grandmother, who filled her childhood with strange tales of European salons, aristocrats, and ballrooms that shimmered like myths. They were bedtime stories, fanciful nonsense, or so Eliza thought. That belief unraveled the morning a man in a tailored gray suit stepped into the diner and asked for her by name. He introduced himself curtly as Jonathan Graves, legal representative of the Hensley estate, one of the oldest and most obscenely wealthy families on the Upper East Side. His presence, so out of place among chipped mugs and the hiss of the griddle, unsettled her. He handed her an envelope, official, embossed, and terrifying, and explained that the late Margot Hensley had left behind a letter written in 1949 in an obscure French dialect. The family needed a translator. It wasn't a job offer. He clarified it was a request, a peculiar, private one, and Eliza, for reasons he didn't explain, had been specifically chosen. 2 days later, Eliza stood at the gates of the Hensley mansion, a towering edifice of stone and secrets tucked behind iron fences and manicured hedges. It wasn't just another world, it was another universe. Inside, the ceilings were high enough to swallow her voice, and the silence pressed on her shoulders like expectation. Carter Hensley greeted her, if a cold nod could be called a greeting. At 38, he was polished, sharp-jawed, and radiated the kind of disdain that only comes from generations of inherited superiority. He barely looked at her as he led her through the library, where the letter lay encased in a glass folder, treated like a relic. Carter didn't want her there. It was obvious in the clipped edge of his words, the way he avoided eye contact, and the impatient tapping of his fingers on the mahogany desk as she inspected the letter. To him, Eliza was a disruption, a working-class nobody walking through the corridors his mother once ruled with icy grace. He spoke of Margot with reverence and bitterness, often in the same sentence. And he made it abundantly clear that this entire exercise, the letter, the translator, the memory, was beneath him. But it was a matter of legal procedure. He admitted. "Let's get it over with," he said, folding his arms as she began. Eliza didn't flinch at the condescension. She had spent a lifetime smiling through rude customers and arrogant professionals. Instead, she read quietly, carefully. The letter began with polite nostalgia, a recounting of gardens and springs past. But the tone shifted quickly. Margot wrote with guilt, tenderness, and regret. She spoke of a man named Pierre, a French gardener, who had worked for the family in the 1940s, a man she loved, a man from whom she had borne a son in secret, a child taken from her by force and shame, hidden by the family name and given away. As Eliza translated aloud, Carter's posture stiffened. He stopped tapping. His eyes narrowed, fixed on the paper like it might catch fire. There were no interruptions, no mocking comments, only silence. And when she finished, he said nothing for a long time. Eliza, too, was unusually quiet. Something in Margaret's words struck her, not just the emotion, but the specificity of it. The details of Pierre's departure, the references to a second love in the late 1950s, the mention of Queens, they weren't random, they were familiar. Carter finally stood and walked to the window, his back to her. My mother was not impulsive, he said flatly. She didn't leave loose ends. Eliza didn't argue. She simply asked if she could make a copy of the letter for linguistic study. He hesitated, then nodded, already distracted by his thoughts, as she stepped out of the mansion, back into the sunlight and the real world. The weight of what she had read settled over her like mist. That night, Eliza's grandmother stirred in her sleep, murmuring in French about a Pierre. The name hit Eliza like a shock. She leaned in, asked gently, but the old woman only smiled faintly and fell silent. Again, Eliza sat at her side, holding her hand, and wondered how many stories had gone untold, how many truths had been buried not out of malice, but out of fear, of shame, of survival, of silence. Back at the Hensley mansion, Carter poured himself a scotch and reread the letter in private. For the first time in years, he felt uncertain. Margot had been cold, but never cryptic. If what Eliza had translated was true, and something in her steady voice told him it was, then everything he knew about his legacy, his bloodline, might be false. He had never cared much for sentiment, but this wasn't sentiment. It was scandal, betrayal, identity, and he didn't know what terrified him more. That Margot had lied, or that Eliza Moore might be the key to unraveling everything he thought was certain. And so, two worlds had collided, one of silver spoons and sealed records, the other of worn shoes and whispered histories. Neither of them knew it yet, but this was only the beginning. Eliza returned to the Hensley mansion the next morning with a notepad, a recording device, and a calm resolve. She was there to work, and nothing more. Yet the moment Carter stepped into the room, tension surged again. He didn't greet her, didn't ask how she slept, didn't offer water, just pointed to the letter, as if the words themselves had grown heavier overnight. She sat down and resumed the translation, speaking clearly, professionally, while Carter listened in silence, arms crossed, jaw clenched. But as she continued, the tone of Margaret's writing shifted further, no longer just poetic regret, but an open confession. The once elegant phrases gave way to painful memories, sneaking into the garden at night, whispering French into Pierre's ear, her fear of being discovered, and then her heartbreak when she was forced to give up their child. Without ever seeing his face again, Carter said nothing for long minutes after Eliza stopped reading. Then, quietly, almost to himself, he asked, "Do you think it's real?" Eliza didn't answer immediately. She studied the last lines again, noting how the ink changed pressure, how Margot had written, "My only sin was silence," 3 times in a row before ending the page with a final, almost illegible name, Pierre. Eliza's voice softened. "It doesn't read like a story. It reads like a wound." That landed somewhere deep inside him. Carter turned away again, pretending to check his phone, but his hand trembled slightly. He wasn't built for this kind of ambiguity. Business, finance, power games, those were predictable. This WASN single quotes T. By noon, Graves had returned with more documents, Margot's journals, old photographs, and one sealed envelope marked for Carter. If he ever asks, Carter refused to open it. Instead, he waved a hand and muttered, "Put it with the rest." Eliza didn't press. She focused on the task, even as her own mind spun in directions she didn't want to admit. The references in the letter mirrored stories her grandmother used to tell of a man named Pierre, who left for America, who worked for a rich family, who never came back. She remembered a sepia photo of a man in suspenders with a shadowed face. Could it be the same Pierre? Later that evening, back at home, Eliza pulled out an old box from her grandmother's closet. Inside were yellowed letters, receipts in French, and a tiny envelope with a locket. Inside the locket was a photo of a man, same suspenders, same hard-set mouth, and behind it, the name Pierre Lavigne. She stared at it for a long time, then quietly closed the box, her hands slightly trembling. She didn't want it to mean anything. Not yet, not without proof. But something was already cracking open inside her. The following day, Eliza walked into the Hensley mansion with a different posture. Not arrogant, not confrontational, but grounded, as if her presence no longer needed explanation. Carter noticed. He tried to push her again, asking pointed questions, probing whether she was getting too comfortable in his mother's library. Eliza didn't rise to it. Instead, she asked him if he had ever wondered why Margot never spoke of his birth, never showed affection, never treated him like something precious. The question lingered, uncomfortable and uninvited. Carter scoffed, deflecting it with sarcasm. But he didn't answer, and the silence that followed spoke louder than words. That afternoon, the letter revealed its most explosive passage yet. Margot had not only given up her child, she had tracked him down in secret years later. She never approached him, never made contact, but followed his life from afar. She described watching a boy grow up in Queens, smart and quiet, with a young single mother and a love for books. Eliza's throat dried as she translated. Carter leaned forward, his eyes sharp now. "What did you just say?" he asked. Eliza repeated the sentence slowly. His expression shifted, confusion first, then disbelief. He stared at her, and, for a moment, the air felt charged. Dangerous. The lawyers were called again. This time, Carter demanded a background check on Pierre Lavigne. Graves returned with a file that confirmed what Eliza feared. After being dismissed from the Hensley estate, Pierre had stayed briefly in Brooklyn, fathered a second child in Queens, and died in a construction accident when Eliza was just a toddler. Her mother, whose name appeared on hospital records and school applications, had always said he was gone. She had never said why, but now the paper trail was there. The second family, the lineage, the connections, all leading back to Eliza. Carter paced the room like a man losing grip. He asked for the file, then threw it aside. "This is a setup," he muttered. "It's too clean, too convenient." Graves warned him to calm down, but Carter's voice rose. "You think some waitress from Queens just walks in here?" And he stopped himself. Eliza stood perfectly still. She didn't flinch. She didn't reply. She just looked at him, not with anger, but with something quieter. Pity, perhaps. Graves laid the final blow with one last document. Margaret's updated will, signed and witnessed 6 months before her death. In it, she named the lost son of Pierre as a legitimate heir to the Hensley estate, entitled to half of everything. Carter refused to believe it. He questioned the signature, the witnesses, the timing. He accused the firm of manipulation. But his voice lacked conviction now. The doubt had already taken root. Eliza watched the storm unravel without saying a word. She had no need to defend herself. The truth had momentum of its own. When she left that day, Carter didn't walk her to the door. He stayed in the library, gripping a glass of scotch he hadn't touched, staring at the letter as if it might offer him a different ending. Eliza stepped outside, the cold air biting at her cheeks, and felt both lighter and heavier at once. She didn't want the money, didn't want the legacy, but the story had chosen her, and there was no walking away now. In Queens, her grandmother stirred again that night and whispered, "He always said you'd find your place." Eliza sat beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her temple, and whispered back, "Maybe I have." But her voice cracked slightly, because this wasn't just about family secrets or forgotten names. It was about identity, hers, Carter's, Pierre's, rewritten not by fiction, but by the paper-thin difference between truth and silence. The Hensley estate's legal team moved quickly. Within 72 hours, they had verified every document, chased down signatures, re-interviewed old witnesses, and consulted with handwriting analysts. Everything pointed to one undeniable conclusion. Eliza Moore, daughter of Pierre Levigne's second union, was the biological niece of Margot Hensley's lost son. And since Margaret's final will recognized Pierre's direct descendant, as a rightful heir, Eliza stood to inherit half of the family's vast fortune. The implications were staggering. She hadn't asked for any of it, hadn't maneuvered or manipulated, and that, perhaps, made it all the more unsettling to Carter. The empire he had protected for years, the name he had worn like armor, had just been cracked open by a woman he couldn't quite predict or control. When the lawyers laid out the inheritance structure in front of Carter, he barely looked at the numbers. It wasn't about the money. It was about legitimacy, about identity, about the fact that Eliza had walked into his world not to conquer it, but to simply exist, and that was more threatening than any financial loss. He scoffed at the legal jargon, called the lawyers opportunists and accused them of orchestrating a media stunt. But his objections were weak. Eliza hadn't made a single demand. She hadn't hired a PR firm. She hadn't even posted about the situation on social media. She was simply present and unshakably calm. The next morning, the story broke in the press. Somehow, perhaps through a disgruntled employee or a curious clerk, the details leaked. Headlines screamed of a waitress heiress. Tabloids plastered her photo next to Carter's with exaggerated headlines about betrayal and lost fortunes. Eliza woke up to flashing cameras outside her building, reporters yelling her name, and microphones shoved in her face as she stepped out to buy milk. At the diner, customers whispered and stared. Some offered congratulations, others treated her like a fraud. She kept her eyes down, her answers short, not out of fear, but because none of it felt real. Meanwhile, Carter doubled down on damage control. At public appearances, he flashed polite smiles and deflected questions. In interviews, he described the situation as an unfortunate legal misunderstanding and implied that certain people knew how to take advantage of a stroke of luck. The insinuation was clear, but Eliza didn't flinch. She ignored the jabs, the headlines, even the online comments. She went to work, took care of her grandmother, and met quietly with the estate's legal counsel to review documents, all without drama. And that quiet resistance only fueled Carter's frustration. In private, Carter began digging. He pulled financial records, searched hospital registries, even hired a private investigator to look into Eliza's background. But everything came back clean. There were no lawsuits, no suspicious bank activity, no evidence of fraud. Just a young woman who had spent her entire life working two jobs and caring for an elderly relative. The more he looked, the more absurd it became. This woman, whose only crime was being born into the wrong branch of his family tree, now held claim to half of everything he thought was sacred. The breaking point came during a foundation board meeting. Carter was presenting a new initiative when one of the trustees, an old friend of Margaret's, gently asked what role the new heir would play in the organization. The room went silent. Carter, caught off guard, offered a clipped answer about pending legal matters, but the damage was done. The seed had been planted. Eliza's presence wasn't just a legal footnote. It was a shift in legacy, and the vultures could already smell the blood in the water. That evening, Carter confronted Eliza in the library. It wasn't planned. She had stopped by to return an original copy of the translated letter, and he found her alone, flipping through one of Margaret's travel journals. His voice was sharp, almost desperate. "What do you want?" he asked, not in the transactional sense, but something deeper. Eliza looked up, met his eyes, and answered simply, "The truth." He scoffed, but there was no force behind it. "You already have it," he said. "You got your inheritance, your story in the papers. What more is there?" She stood, closed the journal, and said quietly, "I didn't ask for any of it, but I'm not walking away either." That moment shattered something in him. He had expected her to be either meek or aggressive, either grateful or greedy. But she was none of those things. She was rooted, and he hated how much that unnerved him. The following week, an elderly man came forward, Joseph Blake, once a groundskeeper at the Hensley estate. He had recognized Liz's photo in a newspaper and contacted the lawyers. In a sworn deposition, he confirmed the romance between Margot and Pierre, said he had once walked in on them in the greenhouse, said he remembered Margot crying for days after Pierre was dismissed. Most importantly, he recalled Margot visiting a hospital under a false name in 1950. The same week Pierre left New York. His statement sealed the case. Carter didn't attend the deposition. He was at a silent investor summit in Chicago, trying to secure capital for a biotech expansion. But the fallout followed him. Whispers grew louder. Business partners pulled back. Shareholders requested clarity. And for the first time in years, he found himself not at the center of the narrative, but reacting to it. He wasn't leading. He was defending. Back in Queens, Eliza received a formal notice from the estate attorneys. Half of Margot Hensley's assets would be transferred to her over the coming months, including a stake in the foundation, a trust fund, and legal co-ownership of the family mansion. She sat on the edge of her bed reading the document, her grandmother's breathing soft behind her, and let the weight of it sink in. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just folded the letter, placed it in a drawer, and poured herself a cup of tea. Because the inheritance was never the point. What mattered was what it meant. That she hadn't been a mistake. That Pierre had mattered. That the stories whispered in French under dim lamps had been real. At the mansion, Carter sat alone in the grand dining hall, staring at a half-empty glass. The chandelier above him flickered. For years, he had believed his place in the world was secured by blood and legacy. Now he wasn't sure what either of those meant. He had power, but no peace. Control, but no clarity. And worst of all, for the first time, he wasn't sure if the enemy was Eliza or the lies his family had built their empire upon. By the end of the month, Eliza's life had changed completely, at least on paper. Her name now appeared beside Carter's on official documents, board records, property deeds. She hadn't moved into the Hensley mansion, nor changed her address. But the media treated her like royalty or a fraud, depending on the headline. Paparazzi followed her to the diner, stalked her neighborhood, and speculated endlessly about whether she would embrace the Hensley lifestyle. Carter, meanwhile, maintained his composure in public, but inside, his resentment hardened into something colder. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about dignity, about legacy, and the quiet terror that he might be remembered as the man who lost everything, not to scandal, not to crime, but to the quiet, unshakable presence of a woman who never raised her voice. The pressure mounted fast. Carter's public image, once sleek and untouchable, began to erode. A viral video surfaced of him snapping at a doorman. Another clip of him refusing to shake a janitor's hand at a fundraising gala. People began asking questions not just about the inheritance, but about Carter himself. Why did he fight so hard to discredit Eliza? Why did he refuse to acknowledge Margaret's past? And what exactly did he stand for beyond boardrooms and bravado? Every news cycle sharpened the contrast between them. Eliza, quiet and composed, still riding the subway and shopping at discount markets. Carter, flashing forced smiles while his empire wobbled beneath him. The final blow came when an internal Foundation email leaked to the press. In it, Carter referred to Eliza as a parasite and implied that she would fade away once the public grows bored. The backlash was immediate. Sponsors pulled out. Donors threatened to withdraw. Staff members whispered in hallways. And Eliza, without saying a word, simply showed up to the next board meeting, sat in the chair with her nameplate beside his, and listened. When asked if she had any comment, she declined. She didn't need to defend herself. Carter's words had done the damage for her. Back home, Eliza's grandmother grew weaker. The once vibrant woman who taught her French and held the weight of Pierre's memory in her bones now spent most of her days sleeping. Eliza stayed close, reading to her, brushing her hair, telling her about things she would never post online, like how Margot's had been written in the same cadence as the bedtime stories she used to hear, like how Carter, for all his anger, seemed more lost than cruel, and how sometimes the greatest inheritance wasn't gold or land, but clarity. The old woman would smile faintly and whisper, "Je savais, mon ange, depuis toujours." I always knew, my angel, always. But as the legal process advanced and the media frenzy exploded, a more sinister presence began to emerge. Investors once loyal to the Hensley brand now saw weakness and opportunity. One in particular, a hedge fund manager named Silas Grant, began a slow, methodical campaign to push Carter out of several joint ventures. Grant was everything Carter wasn't: charismatic in public, ruthless in private, and patient. He began courting board members, wooing donors, and feeding subtle rumors to the press. Stories about Carter's volatility, his arrogance, his failure to adapt, and unlike Eliza, Grant had no interest in heritage. He wanted power, and he saw the fracture in the Hensley Foundation as the perfect entry point. Eliza heard whispers of Grant's moves, but chose to stay out of it. She had no appetite for corporate warfare. Her role in the foundation remained focused restoring the historical archives, overseeing grants to underfunded schools, and managing the estate's philanthropic arm. But even her presence became a threat to Grant. He couldn't discredit her the way Carter had tried. She was too clean, too grounded, too impossible to provoke. So he shifted strategy. Isolate her, distract her, dilute her authority. His first attempt came in the form of a friendly suggestion from one of his surrogates that Eliza should step away from the board temporarily to reflect on the sudden changes in her life. She declined, calmly, firmly, and that was when things turned personal. One morning, a gossip blog released photographs of Eliza's grandmother leaving a medical clinic. The captions were cruel, the tone mocking. Comments poured in questioning why an heiress would let her family live in poverty while sitting on millions. Eliza was furious, but she didn't lash out. Instead, she called the clinic, arranged for private home care, and instructed her lawyers to investigate how the photos had been obtained. No lawsuits, just precision, just action. Carter, watching from the shadows of his office, finally began to see her clearly not as a threat, but as a mirror. Her restraint, her refusal to be baited, her quiet endurance. It wasn't weakness. It was strength of a kind he had never learned. For the first time in weeks, he reached out not through lawyers or staff but directly. He sent her a message. You were right. The truth doesn't need defense. But sometimes it needs protection. Eliza didn't respond. Not yet. But something shifted. The next time they saw each other was not in the library or the courtroom but in a hospital hallway. Her grandmother had taken a turn. Carter had come, uninvited, unsure why. He didn't speak much, just stood beside Eliza as a nurse explained options and outcomes. And when her grandmother passed 2 days later, he was the only one outside the room besides the staff. He didn't offer platitudes. He didn't try to comfort. He simply stood, silent, as Eliza held her grandmother's hand and whispered goodbye. That night, she found an envelope at her door. Inside was a photograph fold, faded, showing Pierre in his younger years, holding a newborn wrapped in blankets. On the back, written in Margaret's hand, "Forgive me. I tried to be brave." Eliza stared at it for a long time before placing it on the nightstand. The war for wealth and recognition had never been hers to fight. But the quiet dignity of that photo, the decades it survived, those belonged to her. And to Carter, perhaps, who now found himself less concerned with ownership and more with understanding what had been lost long before Eliza ever walked into his world. The courtroom was smaller than anyone expected. No grand marble columns or echoing ceilings. Just worn benches, a weary judge, and the low hum of air conditioning that made the silence feel heavier. Eliza sat with her back straight, hands folded, eyes fixed on the front. She wasn't nervous. The outcome was already written in files and affidavits, sealed in witness statements and hospital logs. The point now wasn't victory. It was completion. A final, public acknowledgement that the story wasn't fiction. That Pierre had lived and loved and left behind more than footprints. Carter, 3 rows ahead, stared straight ahead, unmoving, his jaw tight, shoulders set. He hadn't spoken to Eliza in weeks, not since the hospital. But something had shifted in him. Not a surrender, but an understanding of what pride had cost him and what silence had buried. The Hensley lawyers opened the case with professionalism, citing lineage, legitimacy, and the explicit language of Margaret's will. The opposing team, representing Carter's attempt to challenge the validity of Eliza's claim, was sharp, relentless, and ultimately powerless. Every objection was met with hard evidence. Every doubt raised was crushed by documentation, recordings, photos, and most damning of all, the live testimony of Joseph Blake. The man's voice cracked with age, but held nothing back. He confirmed the relationship between Margot and Pierre, recalled the night Margot broke down in the greenhouse, identified the sealed envelope she had once handed him in case the truth ever needed light. And when that same envelope was presented in court, opened by the judge, and read aloud, the courtroom felt as still as a grave. Inside was Margaret's handwritten statement, dated nearly a decade before her death, confessing the circumstances of her son's birth and her guilt. Over what followed, she acknowledged Pierre by name, referenced their secret meetings, and expressed her wish that if any part of her estate were to survive, it should honor not the name Hensley, but the people she had once failed. It was more than enough when the judge declared Eliza the rightful heir. When he confirmed the legality of her claim and denied all challenges, no one cheered. There was no applause, just that same silence, thick with finality. Carter stood before the judge, asked them to rise. He didn't turn around. He didn't look at Eliza. And yet, in that moment, it was clear to everyone that the true reckoning had little to do with money. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Microphones were shoved into faces, flashbulbs exploded, and questions flew like arrows. What will you do with the money? Will you join the foundation board? Are you and Carter on speaking terms? Eliza answered none of them. She walked through the crowd like fog through trees, untouched, unfazed, unwilling to perform. Back in Queens, her apartment was quiet. Her grandmother's absence filled the air with a heaviness that even victory couldn't lift. Eliza placed the court documents in the same drawer as the letter, the locket, the photo of Pierre. Together, they formed a timeliner breadcrumb, trail of loss, silence, truth, and reclamation. She didn't feel richer. She felt seen. For the first time in her life, her identity wasn't something to hide or explain. It simply was. But the world didn't stay quiet for long. Silas Grant, sensing Carter's weakened position, escalated his assault. He launched a media campaign questioning the Hensley brand's integrity, citing the family's history of cover-ups and using Eliza's sudden inheritance as evidence of internal chaos. His goal was to fracture the board, break confidence in Carter's leadership, and slide into control under the banner of reform. It was vicious and calculated, and it was working. Investors grew wary. Donors stepped back, and Carter, for all his strategic mind, was cornered by optics he could no longer manipulate. Eliza was called to an emergency foundation meeting. She arrived dressed in black, not as a statement, but out of respect for the weight of what was coming. Silas made his move with charm, offering to assist with a restructuring of leadership, proposing himself as interim chair. His speech was smooth, peppered with compliments toward Eliza, painting her as a fresh voice who deserved guidance. But when he asked her to support his nomination, she paused, then declined. She didn't raise her voice, didn't argue. She simply said, "This is not what Margot built the foundation for." And the room shifted. Some in the boardroom exhaled. Others sat straighter. Grant's smile thinned. After the meeting, Carter approached her privately. There was no hostility now, only fatigue. "He won't stop," he said. "Not until he owns what's left." Eliza studied him. "Then don't give him anything to own." Carter almost laughed, but the weight in his eyes was real. "You're better at this than I ever was," he said, "and I hate that it took all this for me to see it." Eliza didn't gloat. She didn't offer comfort. She simply said, "Then let's stop pretending we're enemies." In the days that followed, They formed a reluctant alliance, not out of affection or nostalgia, but necessity. Carter handled the financial recovery, quietly reinforcing investor ties. Eliza, with no interest in power plays, focused on stabilizing the Foundation's mission. They coordinated statements, tightened messaging, and shut Grant out of critical meetings. It was slow, careful work but effective. And through it all, something almost like respect began to form between them. Not friendship, not yet, but recognition. The courtroom verdict had given Eliza a title. But it was this weathering the storm with integrity that gave her place. The media grew bored of the story. New scandals took their place. Cameras faded. But within the walls of the Hensley estate, a quieter transformation had begun. One, not measured in dollars or headlines, but in trust rebuilt, in legacies reshaped, into people learning to coexist not as rivals, but as survivors of a history neither of them wrote, but both inherited. Eliza never moved into the Hensley mansion, despite now owning half of it. The East Wing remained untouched, wrapped in dust and echoes, a silent relic of Margaret's reign. She didn't need the space, didn't crave the prestige, and every time she passed its towering iron gates, she felt a quiet reminder that some inheritances were best left unoccupied. Instead, she remained in Queens, kept her grandmother's apartment, and lived with the same deliberate simplicity she always had. Except now, there were no bills she couldn't pay, no fears about health care, and no customers to serve at the diner. The freedom was unfamiliar, not intoxicating, just still, as if the noise had finally stopped, and now she could hear herself think for the first time. The media had shifted its attention elsewhere. New controversies, younger scandals, fresher faces. Eliza didn't miss the headlines. Her days were filled with the mundane work of purpose streamlining the Foundation's charitable divisions, auditing scholarship programs, quietly adding funding to clinics in underserved neighborhoods. She made no speeches. She declined interviews. Her influence grew not through charisma, but consistency. And those who worked beside her began to notice the rare kind of power she carried. Not loud or desperate, but deeply rooted, the kind that didn't ask for permission or applause. Carter, meanwhile, was unraveling, slowly, privately, and with the cold precision of a man watching the scaffolding of his legacy erode. The investors he'd spent years courting were hesitant now, uncertain of his judgment, unsure where the old brilliance had gone. His name still held weight, but his grip on the empire had loosened. He had not been removed, not disgraced, but forgotten. And in that quiet exile, he found himself staring too long at the past, at what Margot had hidden, at what he had failed to see, and at Eliza, whose mere existence had become a haunting mirror to his own reflection. He stopped attending public events, cancelled 3 major deals, let calls go unanswered. Rumors spread, of course, burnout, depression, a secret illness, but the truth was more elusive. Carter wasn't broken. He was shedding. The ambition, the posture, the need to dominate, none of it felt real anymore. He would walk alone through the west wing of the mansion, past portraits and relics, past locked rooms and shuttered windows, until one day, He found himself standing outside the door Margot had kept sealed for decades. It took him nearly 10 minutes to open it. Inside was a room preserved in time, dust-covered furniture, a piano with yellowed keys, and on the wall, a photo of Pierre, not a formal portrait, but a candid shot of him laughing, shirt sleeves rolled up, hands stained with soil. There were letters, too, dozens of them, all addressed to no one, dated and unsigned. Margot's handwriting, unmistakable, confessions without audience, regrets never mailed. Carter read through them. For hours, and for the first time, he cried, not out of grief, but out of recognition. His mother had built her world around silence, and so had he. Weeks passed before Eliza saw him again. He showed up unannounced at the foundation office, looking thinner, quieter. He didn't knock, just stood in the doorway until she noticed him. She didn't smile, but she didn't dismiss him either. He asked if she had time. She nodded. They talked for 40 minutes, most of it not about the past or money, but about what came next. Carter admitted he was stepping back, resigning from 3 boards, liquidating to investments, not because he had to, but because he didn't know who he was when he wasn't fighting. Eliza listened, offered no judgment, only one question. What do you want now? He didn't have an answer, not yet. But the fact that he was asking himself was progress enough. By the time autumn settled over New York, Eliza had become something of an enigma. The city still whispered about her, but in quieter tones, admiration cloaked in curiosity. She had declined luxury, avoided politics, and refused to turn her story into a brand. In doing so, she had built something rarer than influence trust at a private donor summit. An older woman approached her with tears in her eyes and said, "Your grandmother would be proud." Eliza didn't respond. She just nodded. Because pride wasn't something to wear. It was something to carry. The east wing of the mansion remained empty, untouched by contractors or decorators. But once, late at night, Eliza let herself in. Not to stay, just to walk. She traced the hallways in silence, ran her fingers along the wallpaper, stood in the parlor where Margot once entertained ambassadors and heirs, and for a moment, she could almost hear the music, the clinking of glasses, the laughter of people. Long gone, she didn't belong to that world, but neither did it belong to itself anymore. It had shifted quietly under her feet, and in that subtle transformation, something settled. Not triumph, not revenge, but peace, a kind that didn't demand attention, a kind that echoed in small rooms, in whispered goodbyes, in letters never sent. Eliza had inherited far more than property or wealth. She had inherited a burden of truth and borne it with grace, and now, finally, the weight had begun to lift. The letter arrived without a return address, delivered by hand in a plain envelope tucked beneath the foundation office door. Eliza noticed it that evening, after everyone had left. No name on the outside. Inside, a single page. Carter's handwriting precise, controlled, and yet unmistakably different. There was no apology, no sweeping declaration, just a quiet monologue, a reflection on watching her from a distance, on the lessons learned not through confrontation, but observation. He admitted that every version of power he had clung to wealth. Legacy, image had failed to prepare him for the reality of someone like her. Not because she challenged him, but because she never tried to. She didn't fight him. She just existed, unwavering, unshaken, and that, he confessed, was the most disarming thing of all. Eliza sat alone in her small office, reading the letter 3 times. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She folded it carefully and placed it in the same drawer where she kept Margit's letter, Pierre's photograph, and the court ruling. The gesture, though silent, weighed more than any press conference or formal apology could. Carter's words carried something rarer than regret awareness. It was a subtle act of surrender from a man who had spent his life performing strength. And in that small page, he had finally chosen stillness. That week, the board received Carter's formal resignation from all remaining positions. The news barely rippled in the press. The world had moved on. The scandal no longer useful. The narrative exhausted. But internally, the shift was seismic. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, the Hensley name no longer dictated the course of the foundation, and Eliza, without campaign or demand, became its central figure not as a replacement, but as a redirection. She wasn't Margot. She wasn't Carter. She was something new. And in that distinction, the entire structure began to breathe differently. She visited the mansion less now. Her work kept her grounded in the outer boroughs, in schools that needed roof repairs and clinics short on staff. Her wealth no longer startled her. She had found a rhythm, donating quietly, investing purposefully, and never allowing her name to be used as leverage. Journalists still tried to bait her into interviews. She declined. Biographers reached out. She ignored them. Her story wasn't a product. It wasn't meant to sell anything. It was meant to end quietly, like a storm receding into the sea. One evening, as she walked home from a community meeting, her phone buzzed. A message from Carter. Not a plea, not a question, just an immature childhood photo she had never seen before. Her mother, barely 20, holding a toddler Eliza on a park bench. Sunlight across their faces. No caption, no explanation. She stared at it for a long time, then sent a single reply, "Thank you." There was no follow-up. No need for one. By now, Carter lived quietly in the Hudson Valley, far from the city and its endless performances. He had sold several properties, donated others, and disappeared from social calendars entirely. Some called it disgrace. Others called it retreat. Eliza knew better. It was transformation, not loud or public, but internal. She didn't visit. They didn't exchange calls. But every so often, an article would mention his name in the context of an anonymous donation, or a new mentoring program for foster youth. And each time, she felt a quiet affirmation that maybe, just maybe, some broken things could bend without shattering. That fall, a journalist finally published a retrospective piece not about Eliza's fortune, but about legacy. The article described the Hensley family arc as a parable, not a scandal. It painted Eliza not as an outsider who invaded a dynasty, but as someone who exposed its hidden chambers, lit candles where the windows had been bricked over, and then stepped back without demanding a crown. The piece concluded with a line that stayed with her for days. Some people inherit power. Others inherit silence. Only a few learn how to turn silence into voice without ever raising it. That night, Eliza returned to the East Wing for the first time in months. She didn't just walk the halls, she opened the windows. Let the cold wind in. Let the house breathe. It didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt old, but alive. She stood in the ballroom, staring up at the chandelier Margot once chose from a Parisian catalogue, and whispered softly in French, "It's done now." Not as an end, but as a release. Outside, the city pulsed on, indifferent, sprawling, eternal. But inside that house, in that moment, a chapter closed not with thunder, but with the kind of silence that holds peace. It was early spring when Eliza returned to the park she used to visit with her grandmother. An ordinary patch of green tucked between two concrete blocks in Queens, where benches were worn and the trees leaned slightly from years of wind. The magnolias hadn't yet bloomed, but the air carried the faint promise of change. She sat on the bench where her grandmother used to hum French lullabies, and pulled a book from her coat pocket, not to read, just to hold. The same one her grandmother read aloud during long winter evenings, always skipping the sad parts. Across the path, a young couple played with their child, laughter echoing gently between buildings, familiar and distant all at once. Eliza watched, without intruding, her gaze soft, her presence unnoticed. It suited her. The foundation moved on without fanfare. The programs expanded, the staff grew, and her name appeared less in reports and more in results, quiet grants, anonymous endowments. Partnerships formed not in press rooms, but across kitchen tables and school hallways. She visited the offices less frequently now, trusting the team she had helped build, preferring to engage in ways that left no trace but impact. Some staff members had never even met her in person, only heard stories of her kindness, her restraint, her silence, and that, she understood, was a kind of legacy to one that didn't need to be explained to be felt. She kept the apartment in Queens, repaired the windows, refinished the floor, added a few new shelves, but changed little else. The kitchen still smelled like old wood and lemon soap. The hallway creaked the same way it always had. She didn't redecorate, didn't upgrade anything. To her, permanence wasn't about ownership. It was about memory. A few neighbors knew her story. Most didn't. Occasionally someone would whisper, "That's her," with a trace of awe or suspicion. But the whispers faded quickly. Time had dulled the spectacle, and Eliza never gave it reason to return. Once a month, she took the train to a small museum downtown, where Margaret's personal letters were now archived, not just the infamous one, but a lifetime's worth of correspondences, journal entries, sketches, and programs. She never announced herself, just signed the logbook and read in silence. Sometimes it was painful, other times absurd, but always necessary. She read not to remember Margot, but to understand the gravity of what silence can shape across decades. And the more she read, the more she saw not a villain, but a woman trapped by fear, image, and the fragile illusion of control. A woman she might have become in another life. Carter remained distant. They didn't exchange messages after the last letter. But every so often, news filtered through the launch of a scholarship fund, a community garden built on land he donated, a quiet appearance at a town council meeting. His name no longer carried the same weight. But maybe that was the point. Maybe shedding the name had been his way of learning how to use it. Eliza never sought him out, and he never returned to the mansion. But in a box near her nightstand, she kept his letter creased. Ray Reid, respected, not forgiven, not forgotten, just there, like a marker on the road you've already passed. The east wing of the mansion had changed. She donated most of its contents to historical archives, gave staff full autonomy over its future. Some suggested turning it into a community arts space. Others wanted to open it for educational tours. She approved both proposals without comment. She never moved in, never held a single event there. But once, just once, she returned alone with a key that still worked. She wandered through its corridors without purpose, paused in the old ballroom, and sat on the edge of the grand piano's bench. She didn't play. She simply placed her hand on the keys and let the silence linger long enough to feel real. Then she left the lights off and closed the door behind her. Years passed, marked not by headlines, but by small rituals. A handwritten thank you note from a student in the Bronx, a photo of a restored library in rural Pennsylvania, the sound of a child learning French from a volunteer program Eliza had funded. The world had moved on, but these details remained tucked into drawers, woven into conversations, living quietly in places most people would never visit. Her influence wasn't invisible. It was just uninterested in being seen. And on a day like any other, she walked the same route through the park, past the newsstand that no longer carried her face on covers, past the cafe where she once read legal documents beside steaming coffee. She paused at a crosswalk, the light changing slowly, and met eyes with a stranger who gave her a polite nod. Unaware of who she was, she nodded back, grateful, not for anonymity, but for normalcy, for the fact that peace, when earned, doesn't demand recognition. She stepped forward with the crowd, the noise of the city swelling and fading like waves. No dramatic endings, no sweeping conclusions, just the steady rhythm of footsteps moving forward. And somewhere in that ordinary motion, the story wrote its final line not in ink, not in headlines, but in the quiet certainty that nothing more needed to be said.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. Your support helps us grow and bring you even more amazing content. See you in the next one.